Welcome back to the shop. Today I'm working on making an air hose reel. I have a strict budget of free, so I'm going to make it out of whatever junk I have laying around. Here's the plan. This big piece of pipe is the centerpiece of the design. The hose wraps around it, and the air will also pass through it into the hose. The pipe has these two metal plates on either side of it. This one is just an end cap, and this one is where the air comes in. They also provide a mount for these big wooden circles which make up the sides of the reel. This piece holds the spool within the mounting bracket. This second, longer part also holds the spool, but it's also half of a custom swivel fitting, which creates a rotating but airtight seal. The handle also attaches to this part. This block is the other half of the custom swivel connection. It has two intersecting holes. The air flows into one and out the other into that part we talked about earlier. It has a quick connect fitting to easily plug it straight into the air compressor. This is a very simple part. It just has two holes drilled at 45 degrees from each other and tapped for 1/4 inch NPT threads. There are two more fittings here too. One connects it to the main body and the other connects it to a quick connect fitting that will allow us to connect it to the output hose that we then plug our tools into. The last two pieces are some of the simplest. These two are the handle and these ones are the bracket. The two holes in the bracket here and here fit bearings so the spool can rotate. Alright, with the top level overview out of the way, let's go build it. I'm going to start with the largest part. At some point someone welded a plate onto this piece of pipe, so I'll need to cut it off before I can use it. Then, I just need to clean up the ends for welding. Since this part is quite long, I had to use my homemade steady rest to do this. This next part was pretty simple. I turned a small step on the end, which will slot into the plate later. This other side needs to fit inside of a bearing, and I really want it to be just a light press fit so it stays in place. Then, I started on this plate, which the last part will fit into. I cut a little recess for the step, and then I bored it to the right size for a precise fit. I checked it to make sure that it fits well, which of course it does. This other plate needs a hole going all the way through. I bored this one out too. Then I set my calipers to the outer diameter of the pipe and used them to draw a guideline for welding. This piece was originally part of a grate, so I had to grind some leftover welds off of it. Then I could turn it down to remove rust and other defects. It needs a step on the end, just like the other one, and I also need to cut two O-ring grooves. I went ahead and slid the O-rings in so they show a little bit better. I also cut a little relief on the side, which will let the part spin easily inside of a hole. Then, I drilled a long hole for the air to flow through. It's hard to see how far it goes in, but it's about as far as the O-rings. I also cut a deep groove in between the O-rings. They'll keep this area sealed and allow air to flow through. After that, I could cut the whole piece off from the stock to finish the other side. I lightly rounded off this end and then drilled a hole in it. I planned to use this hole to retain the handle, but didn't wind up needing it. Over on the milling machine, I used a square collet block so I could drill 4 evenly spaced holes in the groove. The air can flow through the groove and into the holes, down to the hole that runs through the shaft into the big pipe. The exact size of these holes isn't really critical, but bigger holes will grant you better airflow and, of course, more power to your tools when the time comes. Remember that a bigger hole is going to make the shaft weaker, so you're going to have to decide exactly where that point is for you. Then, the last thing I had to do was mill a flat for attaching the handle. I started the next part by cutting off a piece of aluminum with the bandsaw. The block was extremely rough, so I squared it up on the milling machine before I got started with the other operations. I found the center, drilled a large hole in it, and tapped it with 1/4 inch NPT threads. Then, I turned the piece on its side, and found the center again to drill another hole, which intersects with the first. That earlier piece with the O-rings will fit into this hole. I bored it out because it needs to be a very precise fit, or the O-rings aren't going to seal. Then, I drilled and tapped a few holes just to mount it with. I cut off another block of aluminum for the next part. I flattened it out and cut two 45-degree sides on it. I drilled 2 holes in the sides and tapped them with 1/4 inch NPT threads. This part is called an 135-degree elbow because even though the holes are at 45 degrees relative to each other, they're at 135 degrees relative to straight, and naming conventions are weird. It might be hard to find a fitting like this in a store, but you should be able to get one online. I just made my own because it was cheaper and easier. This part will screw into the side of the hose reel so the hose can attach at an angle instead of sticking straight out. Here's another part I really didn't have to make, but it was just simpler to. This is a barbed hose fitting. It really doesn't matter how many of these barbs there are as long as it's more than, say, 2, but I just copied mine from a commercial one. Then I flipped it around and cut a quick connect fitting into the other side. This is what all my hoses accept, and as you can see, it fits pretty well. For the sides of the reel, I picked out some large pieces of OSB. They're a little bit past their prime, but I did say I was making this out of mostly garbage. I marked the center of the wood, then drilled out a large hole in both pieces. I used a Forstner bit. They're really good for OSB because they don't tear out much. I marked out the edges of a large circle, and I removed most of the waste on the miter saw. I just used a scrap piece of aluminum in the center to keep the two pieces aligned while I cut them. I had to take them over to the lathe to turn them round, which is honestly pretty scary, but it went just fine. Then, I drilled a few mounting holes to attach them to the metal plates. For the handle, I just used a chunk of pine. It's a very soft wood, prone to tear out, and you can see the finish it leaves is not the best. But a little sanding takes care of that pretty quickly. I drilled a hole straight down the middle for a bolt to go in, which will allow it to rotate. I quickly knocked out a little rectangular section, and then drilled a few holes in it for the other part of the handle. The last piece I need is the bracket that'll mount the reel to the ceiling. I picked out some more OSB, and it wasn't even rotten this time. I cut it to length and marked out where the bearings will go in the center here. I also cut a large chamfer and drilled holes for the bearings. I used a Forstner bit again for this, but I didn't have one of the exact size I needed, so I bored the holes out over on the milling machine. The fit here is just about right. The bearing isn't too tight, but the outer race won't turn in the wood. I drilled a few holes to put it together with. The small amount of glue area on here just wouldn't be enough, so I used wood blocks to hold it together in the corners. Now we're ready for assembly. I welded the steel plates to the bigger pipe. I stick welded it mostly because argon is expensive. I added the long pieces next. First, I welded on the one with the O-rings. I had to TIG weld that one very carefully because it had to be airtight. Then, I welded the shorter, less interesting one, but I just tacked that on because it just needs to be there. I drilled and tapped a hole in the big pipe. It's only about 3/16 of an inch thick, so there isn't much for the threads to hold onto, but it should be enough. Unfortunately, I put the hole a bit too close to the edge, and I couldn't screw the fitting in. I had to open up the side, which is really annoying, but it worked out fine after that. I attached the elbow with a nipple and some Teflon tape. On the other side, I added a quick connect fitting so I could remove the hose quickly if I need to. Then, I slid the rotating fitting onto the pipe with the O-rings. I transferred the mounting holes from the wooden plates to the metal ones and screwed them on. Then, I painted all the wooden parts black so they looked a little bit less like garbage. I put the spool assembly into the mounting bracket, and then I could actually mount it to the ceiling. I connected a length of hose between the spool and my air compressor, but I didn't attach it to the wall because sometimes I need to move the air compressor around. Honestly, I'm really happy with the way that it turned out, considering it's mostly made out of junk I had lying around. It's been a few months since I made it, and it's been working out great. And, of course, it was much cheaper than any commercial product I could have bought.